If you wake up in 2026 with the same mindset, the same habits, and the same circle you have right now, your life will be exactly where it is today. And that should terrify you. Because the truth is, success isn't about what you need to add next year. It's about what you need to delete before it even begins. Today, I'm going to show you the 5 things silently destroying your potential and how removing them will change everything. You convince yourself you have time because it feels safe to believe that tomorrow will look just like today. And you delay the work because rushing feels uncomfortable and committing feels risky. And you assume your goals will patiently wait for you while you figure out the perfect moment to begin. And you forget that time doesn't pause just because you're overwhelmed or unsure. And you underestimate how quickly 1 year can disappear when you're busy just getting by. And you think you'll wake up one day magically motivated to start becoming the person you want to be. And you talk about your dreams as if the universe owes you unlimited chances to chase them. And you don't realize that every week you wait is a week your future self has to pay for. And you don't see the cost until you look back and notice how much potential dissolved in your routine. And you continue living as if you have an extension on your destiny that hasn't been granted. And urgency isn't taught. It's realized the moment you admit you've already wasted enough time. And it strikes when you notice that your excuses aren't protecting you. They're imprisoning you. And it forms when you see people with less talent, but more discipline passing you effortlessly. And it grows when you realize success isn't mysterious, but simply the reward for consistent action. And it deepens when you understand that every delay strengthens the identity you're trying to escape. And it sharpens when you admit that doing nothing is still a choice, and usually the worst one. And it becomes powerful when you stop negotiating with yourself about what you're capable of. And it becomes transformational when you accept that your results don't lie. You simply haven't acted enough. And it becomes your greatest ally once you start choosing progress over perfection. And it becomes the turning point the moment you stop waiting for life to change and start changing yourself. And most people hide behind the belief that they need more time because it gives them permission to stay comfortable. And they assume clarity will appear out of thin air if they wait a little longer. And they convince themselves they need more confidence before taking the first step. And they imagine that future circumstances will somehow be easier, calmer, or more supportive. And they treat procrastination like a temporary habit instead of a long-term identity. And they don't acknowledge that avoiding discomfort creates a life filled with larger discomforts. And they don't see that fear grows every time they choose delay over action. And they don't understand that starting before you feel ready is the only way readiness is built. And they don't realize that waiting for the perfect moment destroys momentum before it ever exists. And they don't recognize that time is silently shaping their character, whether they use it or waste it. And your life changes when you treat time as a limited resource instead of an emotional cushion. And you start organizing your day around what matters instead of what feels easy. And you stop overthinking because you understand that action reveals answers faster than reflection. And you stop being fragile with your schedule and start being disciplined with your priorities. And you stop giving hours to distractions that leave you empty and irritated afterward. And you stop tolerating routines that make you tired but don't move you forward. And you start valuing small progress because you finally see how it compounds. And you start honoring commitments to yourself as if they were promises to someone you respect. And you start feeling lighter because decisions become sharper when urgency replaces avoidance. And you start realizing that you don't need more time, you need more intention. And the illusion that you have time disappears when you truly grasp that tomorrow isn't guaranteed. And you understand that life isn't waiting to reward you when you finally feel ready. And you recognize that if you don't build your future will be built by your default habits. And you acknowledge that the gap between who you are and who you want to be closes only through action. And you accept that goals don't expire, but opportunities do. And that window shortens with every delay. And you become aware that motivation isn't a starting point, but a side effect of doing the work. And you see that each day wasted thickens the walls around the life you're trying to outgrow. And you feel a shift when you realize you've already survived every hard thing you once feared. And you choose to step forward even when the path is unclear because movement creates clarity. And you finally understand that deleting the illusion of unlimited time is the first step to reclaiming your power. Some people drain your ambition not because they dislike you, but because your growth exposes their stagnation, and they feel safer when you're struggling because it protects them from confronting their own excuses. And they subtly encourage your comfort because your comfort keeps them from feeling inadequate. And they downplay your goals because big goals demand big discipline, and they don't want to rise with you. And they question your decisions not out of concern, but out of fear that you might actually succeed. And they joke about your self-improvement because it reminds them of the potential they abandoned. And they expect you to stay predictable so they never have to adjust who they are around you. And they celebrate your small wins but panic when you aim for something greater. And they love the version of you that doesn't challenge their worldview. And they resist the version of you that makes them step into responsibility. And you don't need dramatic breakups to protect your ambition. You need disciplined boundaries. And you have to stop giving emotional access to people who haven't earned the right to influence your decisions. And you must enforce distance from anyone who treats your growth like an inconvenience. And you have to stop sharing your dreams with people who consistently shrink them. And you must create space for your future self even if your current circle doesn't understand your direction. And you need to pull back from relationships that drain your energy faster than you can rebuild it. And you have to be intentional about where your attention goes because attention shapes identity. And you must let go of the guilt that comes with choosing yourself for once. And you need to accept that not everyone can go where you're going, and that's okay. And you have to protect the version of you that's still being built from those who only knew the old you. And people underestimate how quickly their environment shapes their standards. And they don't realize that mediocrity spreads when excellence isn't reinforced, and they adapt to the energy around them because the brain prefers belonging over growth. And they eventually normalize negativity and call it realism. And they absorb other people's fears and mistake them for caution. And they mistake criticism for care even when it's rooted in insecurity. And they expect to grow while surrounding themselves with people who don't grow. And they assume ambition can thrive in an environment that undermines it. And they forget that proximity is one of the biggest predictors of potential. And they fail to notice their circle is silently deciding their future. And your relationships should inspire higher standards, not suffocate them. And you need people who challenge your excuses instead of validating them. And you need voices that remind you of your capability when your doubt gets loud. And you need examples of discipline so you can see what's possible instead of assuming it's rare. And you need honesty that pushes you forward instead of comfort that keeps you stuck. And you need people who are genuinely happy when you level up. And you need friends who compete with themselves, not with your progress. And you need partners who support your vision instead of fearing it. And you need energy that fuels you even when life feels heavy. And you need alignment more than you need approval. And growth becomes easier when you stop entertaining relationships built on old versions of you. And you stop shrinking yourself to avoid making others uncomfortable. And you stop downplaying your dreams to protect fragile egos. And you stop apologizing for wanting more out of life. And you stop participating in conversations that don't match your goals. And you stop spending time with people who drain you emotionally. And you stop feeling responsible for fixing people who don't want to improve. And you stop sacrificing your future to maintain familiar dynamics. And you stop pretending you're the same person you used to be. And you stop letting people who haven't evolved influence your direction. And your environment becomes powerful the moment you create it intentionally. And you start choosing relationships that elevate your standards. And you start valuing depth over familiarity. And you start surrounding yourself with people who are committed to their own growth. And you start being selective with your time because time is energy and energy is everything. And you start noticing how much easier discipline becomes when encouragement replaces doubt. And you start feeling lighter when you disconnect from relationships built on negativity. And you start recognizing your ambition is a gift, not a burden. And you start realizing you cannot rise by staying where you no longer belong. And you start finally understanding that deleting the people who drain your ambition is not selfish, it's survival. Most people stay stuck not because they lack ability, but because they cling to an identity that no longer serves them. And they keep replaying old stories about who they are instead of writing new ones about who they can become. And they define themselves by past mistakes even though those moments were never meant to be permanent. And they stay loyal to labels given to them by people who never understood their potential. And they hold on to outdated self-images because the familiar feels safer than the unknown. And they convince themselves they're not that type of person whenever growth demands a new version of them. And they think change requires permission when it only requires decision. And they underestimate how much their identity shapes the choices they make daily. And they don't realize that the ceiling above them is built from beliefs within them. And they continue living small because they can't imagine themselves any bigger. And identity becomes a cage when you replay it long enough that it feels like truth. And you start making decisions that reinforce the limitations you've accepted. And you choose comfort over progress because progress contradicts who you think you are. And you sabotage opportunities because they don't fit the narrative you've carried for years. And you settle for less because less feels aligned with the version of yourself you're used to. And you avoid risks because risks require confidence you haven't yet developed. And you follow patterns you know are destructive because they feel familiar. And you protect your weaknesses instead of challenging them. And you treat potential like a fantasy instead of a responsibility. And you continue repeating the life you say you want to escape. And your identity starts changing the moment you stop worshiping your limitations. And you begin questioning the beliefs that have controlled you for too long. And you stop accepting failure as a sign of inadequacy and start seeing it as a skill building step. And you stop letting your past dictate your future choices. And you start noticing how often your doubts speak louder than your abilities. And you challenge the stories that make you think small. And you reevaluate the traits you've always assumed were permanent. And you ask yourself who you would be if fear wasn't running your life. And you recognize that growth requires shedding, not accumulating, and you realize your identity is flexible, and that realization becomes empowering. And the moment you delete the identity that keeps you playing small, everything opens up. And you begin taking actions that align with the future you want instead of the past you lived. And you say yes to challenges that once intimidated you. And you show up consistently even when motivation is low. And you stop choosing the easy option and start choosing the right one. And you become willing to experience discomfort because discomfort creates transformation. And you develop habits that reinforce the person you're becoming instead of the person you've been. And you make decisions that prioritize growth over ego, and you gain confidence from execution instead of waiting for confidence to magically appear. And you start trusting yourself more because you finally see evidence of your capability, and people underestimate how much identity shapes behavior until they try to change something meaningful. And they think they need new habits when they really need a new self-image, and they try to adopt discipline while still believing they're inconsistent. And they try to become leaders while still seeing themselves as followers. And they try to build confidence while still identifying as insecure. And they try to pursue goals while still believing they're not the kind of person who succeeds. And they try to improve their lives while holding onto beliefs that sabotage every attempt. And they try to change their actions without changing the identity driving those actions. And they forget that identity is the root and habits are the branches. And they don't realize that sustainable change starts from within, not around them. And transformation becomes real when you consciously choose who you want to be and live accordingly. And you start speaking to yourself with the respect you give others, and you stop expecting perfection and start prioritizing progress. And you acknowledge the old identity without allowing it to dictate your future. And you take responsibility for the narrative you tell yourself daily. And you create standards that reflect your potential instead of your fears. And you show up as the person you want to become, not the person you're trying to escape. And you allow yourself to outgrow environments that keep shrinking you. And you commit to actions that reinforce strength instead of weakness. And you finally understand that identity isn't discovered, it's built through decisions. And the identity you choose determines the life you live, and the life you live reinforces the identity you choose. And if you identify as someone who always quits, your actions will follow that expectation. And if you identify as someone who handles challenges, you'll approach obstacles differently. And if you identify as someone who finishes what they start, your consistency will grow. And if you identify as someone capable, you'll stop underestimating your own effort. And if you identify as disciplined, you'll act in ways that prove it. And if you identify as powerful, you'll stop tolerating environments that diminish you. And if you identify as resilient, setbacks won't break you as easily. And if you identify as deserving, your standards will rise. And if you identify as evolving, growth becomes your default mode. And deleting the old identity doesn't mean erasing your past. It means refusing to be defined by it. And you acknowledge who you were without letting it limit who you're becoming. And you release the shame attached to old habits and mistakes. And you let go of the labels that were placed on you during moments of weakness. And you detach from the expectations that kept you operating below your potential. And you stop letting old wounds dictate new opportunities. And you stop repeating patterns that no longer align with your goals. And you stop giving power to beliefs that were formed in survival, not growth. And you create separation between who you were and who you are choosing to become. And you rewrite the story you live by one decision at a time. Mastery doesn't come from doing more. It comes from doing what matters repeatedly and without negotiation. And most people fail not because they lack ambition, but because their habits weaken their momentum. And they spend hours reacting instead of directing their energy with intention. And they jump between tasks, goals, and ideas without ever finishing anything fully. And they surrender their mornings to distractions that set the tone for the entire day. And they choose short-term comfort rather than long-term progress, even when they know the cost. And they underestimate how their routines silently decide their future. And they forget that consistency beats intensity every single time. And they don't realize the habits stealing their focus are stealing their potential, and they continue operating in patterns that keep them exhausted and unfulfilled. And deleting the habits that rob you of mastery starts with brutal honesty about how you use your time. And you acknowledge how often you break promises to yourself for temporary relief. And you evaluate the routines that drain you instead of empower you, and you question the automatic behaviors you've normalized but never examined, and you track the hours lost to scrolling, overthinking, and pointless tasks, and you notice how often you prioritize urgency over importance, and you catch yourself choosing easy wins over meaningful progress, and you identify the habits keeping you busy instead of productive, and you realize that every minute you mismanage compounds into months of stagnation. And you finally admit that success requires discipline, not intention. And mastery requires deleting inconsistency, because inconsistency makes your goals optional. And you stop quitting when things get uncomfortable, because discomfort is part of the process. And you stop treating discipline like a mood and start treating it like a requirement. And you stop relying on motivation, because motivation is unreliable. And you commit to routines even when results aren't visible yet. And you repeat behaviors long enough for them to become part of your identity. And you build habits that reinforce the future you want instead of the present you're trying to escape. And you understand that greatness is built in the days no one sees, and you treat your time as a resource that demands respect. And you show up because showing up is the foundation of mastery. And the habits you delete make as much impact as the habits you adopt. And you eliminate mindless consumption that fills your mind with noise instead of clarity. And you stop indulging in overthinking that paralyzes action. And you cut out late night routines that steal your mornings and your productivity. And you remove tasks that add motion but not progress. And you let go of chaotic schedules that keep you stressed and scattered. And you eliminate people-pleasing behaviors that drain your energy and derail your priorities. And you drop commitments you made out of guilt instead of alignment. And you stop entertaining environments that encourage mediocrity. And you understand that subtraction is often the step that creates breakthrough, and deleting bad habits also means engineering better ones with intention. And you design your day to support your goals rather than sabotage them. And you create systems so discipline feels automatic instead of forced. And you build routines that eliminate friction and strengthen follow through. And you establish boundaries around the time you need to grow. And you replace mindless scrolling with learning or execution. And you shift from consuming content to creating results. And you build a morning routine that sets the tone for your discipline. And you adopt a nighttime routine that protects your energy for the next day. And you align your actions with the identity you're becoming, not the identity you're abandoning. And mastery grows when you stop chasing shortcuts and start embracing consistency. And you accept that repetition is the gateway to expertise. And you stop looking for hacks and start doing the work that actually moves the needle. And you stop comparing your progress to others, because comparison steals your focus. And you remind yourself that slow progress is still progress when it's consistent. And you understand that mastery is boring to everyone except the person committed to it. And you choose patience over instant gratification, because patience builds permanence. And you stop romanticizing the grind and start respecting the process. And you recognize that every small action compounds into something powerful, and you develop the grit to keep going even when results are delayed. An ending statement. And when you delete the habits that dilute your focus, you create space for the discipline that transforms your entire life. And once you commit to that level of mastery, nothing in your path remains impossible.